Welcome to another episode of the Meal Prep Monday podcast. I'm your host and founder of Prep Dish, Allison Schaaf. In today's episode, we are revisiting the topic of salt and salting food, the ideal time to salt various foods, and just really getting into it. Before we get into today's episode, I have an email to read from Prep Dish customer Darlene. Darlene writes, "You all have come into my life at the perfect time. I was ready. I've heard about you through the years, and I'm grateful to be a recent subscriber. I heard about you on Dana K. White's podcast, and I decided to take the leap. Our meals this week have been delicious and have helped us gather as a family and have helped me reach my goal to eat healthier. Thank you for staying on this entrepreneurship journey." Darlene, thank you so much for sharing, for the kind and encouraging words. I have had Prep Dish for going on 13 years now. And sometimes, it's up, down, and all around, but I also use the meal plans here in my household. And I love hearing that you heard about us through the years, but this was the time. If you're listening to this and maybe you've heard about us over the years, and this would be a good time for you to, try out the meal plans and see how they work in your life with your family. So just head to prepdish.com/MPM and you can try them out for 14 days for free. It sounds like that's what Darlene did after listening to, I think that's a Slob Comes Clean podcast. They also have a special 2-week free trial. So again, check out the 2-week free trial if you want to give Prep Dish a try. Okay, now on to today's episode. I will link in the show notes. I have done an episode on salt, and I believe it was as a result of something similar. So there is a book called Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. And I believe our recipe developer on our team, Mary, who's also a dietitian, I think she read it a few years ago. And I think she kind of got re-inspired of like, okay, you need to do an episode, make sure people are adding enough salt to the recipes because it is hard. We're creating these recipes and salt really is kind of a two-taste thing. And there's things that can make a difference. If you're using homemade broth or you buy the low sodium versus the not low sodium of something. And we really just want to make sure that if you are using our meal plans or even just like you're listening here and in your day-to-day life of cooking for your family, I think at least the generation I grew up in, it was kind of this like fear of salt. But in reality, salt is one, it's an essential mineral for our body. And two, it is an essential ingredient in cooking to help food taste good. So anyway, I think, and I was talking to her today, I think she read this book and kind of was like, okay, do an episode on salt. And I did it. And then there's actually continuing education points with this book. And we're both dietitians. So I'm reading the book right now for some continuing education points and was inspired. And I'm thinking I'm 2 chapters in so far, but I think what I'm going to do is this week I'll cover salt, next week fat, then acid and heat. So I'll kind of go through the 4 sections of the book. And also another side note is I think there's a documentary. She was saying there's a documentary. I haven't watched that yet, but between now and the final episode, I'll see if I can look that up. And anyway, she recommended that as well. So anyway, today I want to dive into salt, and I was just going to go through kind of 3 takeaways, and actually the third one is the most in-depth, but 3 takeaways or reminders that I was thought of as I was going through this section. So the first one is that salt is a great way to mask bitterness. And if you're a chocolate fan like I am, you probably know this, a little, sea salt on top of a very dark chocolate can do a great job of kind of balancing out that bitterness. It actually does a better job of balancing bitterness than sugar. So this is something to keep in mind when you're doing, like a salad dressing, and maybe it's a little bitter from, if you've added like an herb or something like that, just adding some salt can help balance out the flavors. The second one, and this was more something that I do, but I don't know that I've really talked about. And that is, and I do this especially with like soups and chilies, because sometimes I feel like they take more salt than what you would think often, especially, I often use homemade broth, which I don't always oversalt my broths. But after reading this book, I'm like, maybe I should be salting my broths better. They would be tastier if I added more salt to them. But I'm always thinking I add less. So then when I use them, I can kind of add as needed versus, once you add too much, you can't really take it away. But the tip was to add, when you say to taste, you can kind of keep adding salt till you get there. But if I have something like a soup, what I'll do often is put like 1 or 2 spoonfuls in a little ramekin or a little bowl and add some salt to that and then taste it and see if it helps. And if it's too salty, then, you haven't ruined the whole thing. And so this can be true for any dish. If you're like, maybe it needs more salt, but I'm not sure because I've already added it. A good tip is to just, do a little single serving or like she recommends just like 1 spoonful, add a little sprinkle of salt there so that you can then, do it before doing to the whole dish. So that's the second one. And then the third piece that I want to get into, and this is going to kind of be the bulk of the episode here, and that is when to add salt, depending on what the ingredient is. And the first one, and this was kind of the biggest reminder for me, and I know we've thought about this before with prep dish and our proteins, because it's protein, is, when do we, like if we add marinades, when do you add that? And those I always do think, especially for bigger cuts of meat, like, adding earlier, giving it 24, even 48 hours with like some beef, like flank steak is what I'm thinking. Those do really nice with a 48-hour marinade. But, that's salt too, right? There's salt in there. But I kind of forget like, oh yeah, she's a big fan of any protein you're going to have, always salting it the night before. And so I've been playing around with that over the past few weeks here at home, just, the night before. As I'm doing dinner or after dinner, I'll kind of figure out, okay, what's the protein for tomorrow? Let me go ahead and add some salt to it so that it's ready to go. Or even, my crock pot things, I found, in between prep dish plans, I'll often have a big cut of meat that I'm throwing in the crock pot, like on a Sunday and to have for the week. And so I've started to season that the night before. So that way by the morning, the salt has had some time. Or even one time I did, breakfast, because it's a 24-hour time. I don't think it needs to be exact on the hours, but just doing it in advance is helpful. So that was actually my biggest takeaway from the entire chapter was I want to get back to seasoning my proteins with salt night before or 24 hours in advance, just to see, how that can increase. It just gives it time to kind of soak in and evenly distribute throughout the protein. Now, the exception on that is any sort of fish or shellfish. You don't want to season that. It's just similar as with a marinade. You don't want to do that more than, I think her rule was an hour. That's what I've kind of heard for marinades too, as I at least remember in culinary school, they always taught us like kind of hours the max, because otherwise it starts kind of eating away. And salt, same thing. You really don't want to, be seasoning your shrimp the night before. Otherwise you're going to have almost like a ceviche by the next day. I don't know if you would with salt, but you'd have it with a marinade for sure. So fish, seafood, not included in that you can kind of do an hour before. So, and I kind of already, as I'm kind of getting ready for dinner, I'm pulling things out and seasoning them as the oven preheats. So I think naturally that kind of works in the flow of how dinners go. And then vegetables. So vegetables, the ideal timing she recommends is 15 minutes before. And I know sometimes with prep dish, we will season it like on prep day. And then, if you chop your sweet potatoes, and that does seem to work fine. I used to do that a lot back when I was a personal chef and I was prepping meals in advance, basically doing prep day for my clients. I often would season the vegetables in advance. And for most vegetables, that works well. The exception would be potatoes, although potatoes soaking in some water with some salt kind of works. So I've found that you can get away with, doing it more in advance. I don't think it's necessary, but just something to think about. If you're going to roast a vegetable, when you turn the oven on to preheat, maybe really quickly add that vegetable to the sheet pan, go ahead and season it just so it has time. And also a big reminder there is just not to wait until after the food has cooked, right? Like you wouldn't want to season your green beans after they've roasted. You really want to do that before. It just has more time for that salt to really get in there and be a part of it. And then the other one, which I actually fell into this trap, is she was talking about beans. And she said it is a myth that if you salt beans while they're soaking, it can make them tougher. They take longer to cook. She said that's actually not true. I had heard that, and I would always season my beans while they're cooking, which her recommendation is either when you're soaking them or while they're cooking, either is fine. And this is if you're making dried beans, not, canned beans, obviously. But next time, I haven't done dried beans since I read this, but I'm thinking next time now I'm going to try and start salting my beans as they soak, because she said it gives more time for that flavor to get in there. So that definitely was a myth that I had in my mind. So I'm going to change that up. So anyway, that is the episode for today. Again, if you want to check out the book, Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, she goes way more into depth. I mean, these chapters are pages long and just goes into a lot of her experience. It's very well written. It's kind of a narrative style and entertaining to read, even though it is more instructional and stuff like that. It really is like a book you can sit down and read if you're into food and cooking and all those things. So that's all I have. I want to remind you, if you want to try out the Prep Dish plans, again, that's prepdish.com/MPM. We have 14 days free. You can try out all 4 of the different types. So gluten-free, paleo, low carb, and then super fast, which is family-friendly, quick and easy meals. We give you a grocery list, prep day instructions, and how to get meals on the table quick and easy. Again, prepdish.com/MPM. If you are a longtime listener of this podcast and have not left a rating and a review, I know I say this, but if you haven't done it and you have a few minutes today, I would so appreciate that. That just helps other people to find this podcast. And speaking of that, if you know of someone that might enjoy this content or this podcast, maybe just take a quick screenshot or hit that share button and share it with someone. Those really do help a lot and mean a lot to me if you do that. So thank you. And I will be back again next Monday talking fat.